Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
My breath hung in the freezing air like suspended crystal shrapnel. I stopped moving. The tactical radio on my shoulder crackled with static, the only sound in a world that had gone dead silent 3 weeks ago. I wasn't shivering from the cold anymore. I was shivering because I smelled it. That distinct, copper tang of old blood mixed with the sharp, electric scent of ozone. They were close. I tightened my grip on the rifle, the polymer freezing against my gloves. Down here, deep in the valley, the snow was waist-deep, hiding the bodies of the hikers who didn't make it out when the sirens first screamed. I heard the sound then. A wet, dragging shuffle. The crunch of frost under a boot that no longer knew how to lift itself properly. I pressed my back against the granite cliff face, the rough stone biting into my hoodie. Do not breathe. Do not move. A figure stumbled into view 20 yards down the trail. It was wearing a torn ranger's uniform, the fabric stained black. It paused, its head twitching in unnatural, jagged motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. It let out a low, gurgling rattle that wasn't quite a groan. It was the sound of lungs filled with fluid and hate. I watched it pass, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Once it vanished into the whiteout, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I turned my head and there it was. Half buried in an avalanche of ice and shale. The heavy steel rim of a blast door. The rumors were true. The government hadn't just abandoned the cities. They had retreated into the earth. And if the scratch marks on the metal were any indication, they didn't go down there alone. I approached the blast door, the snow crunching loudly in the silence. The massive wheel lock was frozen solid, encased in a thick layer of blue ice. I pulled a pry bar from my pack, the metal clinking softly against my tactical vest. I wedged it into the mechanism. With a grunt of exertion that echoed too loudly in the valley, I heaved. Ice shattered. The wheel groaned, a deep metallic scream of disuse. I spun it. 1 rotation. 2. The seals popped with a hiss of escaping air that smelled stale, recycled, and dead. I pulled the heavy door open just enough to squeeze through. Darkness swallowed me whole. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted light. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a concrete corridor that descended sharply into the mountain. Dust motes danced in the light, undisturbed for God knows how long. The air here was warmer, but it carried a different kind of chill. The walls were lined with conduit and pipes, yellow warning stripes peeling away from the gray concrete. I drew my sidearm, the weight of it familiar and comforting. Step by step I descended. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I reached the bottom of the ramp and found myself in a decontamination airlock. The glass on the viewing port was smeared with something dried and brown. Hands. Small hands. Someone had tried to get out. I pushed through the inner doors into the main atrium. It was chaos. Tables overturned, papers scattered like fallen leaves, tactical gear abandoned in piles. But no bodies. Not yet. I moved toward a security desk, my boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum. A logbook lay open. The last entry was scribbled in shaky handwriting. Protocol 7 initiated. Seal the vents. God forgive us. I didn't know what Protocol 7 was, but looking at the darkened hallways branching off into the belly of the mountain, I had a feeling I was about to find out. I checked my mag full. I adjusted the radio on my shoulder, turning the volume down to a whisper. I needed to find supplies. Food, ammo, maybe a working generator. But first, I had to make sure I was truly alone. A clatter from deep down the left corridor made me freeze. It sounded like metal hitting the floor. Then, a low, rhythmic thumping. Like a heartbeat. Or footsteps running. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealed out the blizzard, replacing the howling wind with a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure on my eardrums. I stood in the decontamination vestibule, the red emergency lighting bathing the brushed steel walls in the color of dried blood. My breath hung in the freezing air, a jagged cloud of condensation that refused to dissipate. This place, designated Outpost Sierra 9, wasn't on any civilian map. It was a rumor whispered in refugee camps before they burned, a tomb for the shadow government that thought they could outlast the end of the world. I wasn't here for answers, though. I was here for calories, ammunition, and warmth. The interior temperature gauge read -5 degrees Celsius. Warmer than the mountain peak outside, but cold enough to kill you in your sleep if you weren't careful. I checked the seal on my rebreather, grip tightening on the forend of my suppressed carbine. The bioscanner on my wrist flickered yellow, trace contaminants, atmospheric anomalies, but no active aerosolized pathogens. The automated voice that should have greeted me was dead, likely power cycled into oblivion years ago. I bypassed the inner airlock with a heavy pry bar, the metal groaning in protest as I forced the maglocks to yield. The darkness beyond the door smelled of ozone, stale recycled air, and something sharper, chemical preservation. It didn't smell like rot. That was the first warning, though I didn't recognize it as such at the moment. Usually, the scent of the infection is distinct, necrotic flesh, copper, and sulfur. Here, the air was sterile, almost sweet, like formaldehyde and mint. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the atrium. It was a cavernous space, a brittlest cathedral of concrete and glass. A reception desk sat in the center, papers frozen in mid-scatter across the floor, preserved by the static air. I moved toward the security checkpoint, my boots crunching softly on the linoleum. This was the scavenging phase, the methodical, desperate hunt that defined my existence. I vaulted the desk, rummaging through the drawers. Pay dirt. A box of CR-123 batteries, a pristine multi-tool, and a half-empty box of chem lights. I cracked one, the green glow illuminating a keycard labeled Level 3, Research and Containment. I pocketed it. The corpse of a security guard sat in the chair, slumped forward. I approached with my weapon raised, prodding the shoulder with the barrel. Rigid. Frozen solid. But there was no decay. His skin was a pale, translucent blue, tight against the bone. I leaned in closer, adjusting my light. The veins beneath the skin weren't black or purple. They were bright, crystalline white. It looked like frost had grown inside his circulatory system. I checked his holster, a 9mm sidearm, fully loaded, hammered back. He hadn't fired a shot. I took the gun and the spare mags. Scavenging the dead was a sin I'd made peace with a long time ago. I moved deeper, descending the stairwell because the elevators were death traps without main power. Level 2 was habitation. I cleared room after room, finding a treasure trove of pre-collapse luxury. Vacuum-sealed blankets, tactical fleece liners, and in the mess hall, the Holy Grail. A crate of military-grade MREs that hadn't been picked over by rats or looters. I tore open a chili mac packet, eating the cold, congealed block of calories while reading a manifest left on a table. The date was 3 years after the initial outbreak. They had survived here for a long time. The log entries were manic, scribbled in ballpoint pen. Subject 42 showing resistance to thermal regulation. The cold doesn't kill it, it catalyzes it. I stopped chewing. The evolution of the infection. We always assumed the winter would slow them down, freeze their rotten muscles until they snapped. We were wrong. Down here, in the dark and the cold, the virus hadn't died. It had adapted. I packed my rucksack until the straps dug into my shoulders. Water purification tablets, antibiotics, 3 pounds of dried beef. I should have turned back. I had enough to survive the winter in a hunting blind. But the keycard for level 3 burned a hole in my pocket. Curiosity is a survival trait until it kills you. I descended to the research level. The air here was colder, biting through my layers. The walls were lined with observation windows looking into sealed chambers. And that's when I saw them. The evolution. Inside the chambers, standing in rows like terracotta warriors, were the infected. But they weren't the shambling corpses of the cities. These things were encased in a biological armor of calcified ice. The virus had replaced the water in their cells with a natural antifreeze that hardened into a chitinous shell. They were glistening, jagged statues, their fingers elongated into translucent claws. I found a terminal that still had backup juice, the screen flickering with a low battery warning. I accessed the logs, needing to understand. The lead virologist's audio log played, her voice trembling. Strain Epsilon isn't a necrovirus anymore. It's a parasitic cryophile. It induces a state of vitrification in the host. They don't need to eat. They don't need to breathe. They enter stasis until they detect a heat signature above freezing. Then, the metabolic flash thaw occurs. It makes them fast. God, they are so fast. A sound behind me. The click of a cooling vent? No. The sound of cracking ice. I spun around, raising my rifle. The observation glass to my left had a spiderweb fracture. Behind it, one of the statues was moving. It didn't shamble. It twitched, violent and sharp, shaking off layers of frost. Its eyes snapped open, no pupils, just glowing white orbs tailored for low-light hunting. The glass shattered outward not from a blow, but from the sonic frequency of the shriek it emitted. It was a sound like tearing metal, high-pitched and deafening. I squeezed the trigger, the suppressed thwip-thwip-thwip of the carbine echoing in the hall. The bullets sparked off the creature's chest. The calcified skin acted like ceramic plate armor. Rounds that would have dropped a standard Walker ricocheted, or embedded harmlessly in the outer shell. Headshots, I muttered, panic rising in my throat. Aim for the sensory organs. The thing lunged, covering 20 feet in a second. It was an apex predator evolved for this frozen hell. I dove to the side, feeling the wind of its claws slice the air where my throat had been. I scrambled back, slipping on the slick floor tiles. It turned, its movements jerky but instantaneous, lacking the inertia of a human body. It was like fighting a stop-motion nightmare. I switched the fire selector to full auto. As it sprang again, I unloaded into its face. The unexpected recoil of the sustained burst walked the muzzle up, shattering the crystalline structure of its skull. Blue ichor, thick as syrup, sprayed across the floor. The creature collapsed, convulsing as its nervous system misfired, its limbs thrashing with enough force to dent the steel cabinets. I didn't wait to see if it stayed down. The shriek had woken the others. Down the corridor, the sound of breaking glass erupted like a chain reaction. A chorus of screeches filled the air, vibrating in my teeth. I sprinted toward the secure storage at the end of the hall, the heavy boots I wore feeling like lead weights. I could hear them behind me, the skittering of hard claws on tile, the wet snapping of joints flash thawing for the kill. I reached the heavy blast door labeled Armory/Secure Storage and swiped the keycard. Red light. Access denied? Come on, you piece of junk! I swiped again. The skittering was closer. I could hear the huffing breaths, cold and sharp. Green light. The lock tumbled. I threw myself inside and slammed the manual override button. The door began to slide shut, painfully slow. A hand, pale, jagged, and dripping with blue slime, shot through the narrowing gap, grasping at my tactical vest. I screamed, not in fear but in pure adrenaline fury, and smashed the stock of my rifle down on the arm. It shattered like glass, the forearm snapping cleanly off. The creature outside howled, a sound of alien frustration, as the door sealed with a final, thunderous clank. I slumped against the wall, hyperventilating. The severed hand on the floor was still twitching, the fingers opening and closing, scratching grooves into the metal floor. I kicked it into the corner. I was safe, for the moment. I looked around the room I had trapped myself in. It wasn't just an armory. It was a prototype lab. Along the walls were weapons I didn't recognize, bulky, coil-driven rifles attached to heavy battery packs. And in the center, a cryo case containing a single vial of amber liquid labeled Epsilon suppressor. I had the loot of a lifetime. I had enough firepower to level a city block and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a cure. But as I listened to the scraping and shrieking outside the blast door, realizing there were dozens of them between me and the exit, I knew the hardest part hadn't even started. The infection had evolved to own the cold. And I had just walked into their freezer. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in months. It severed the howling wind of the blizzard outside, replacing the chaotic fury of nature with a dead, pressurized silence that pressed against my eardrums. I stood in the airlock, my breath pluming in the red emergency lighting, waiting for the decontamination cycle that never came. The sensors were dead, just like everything else in this frozen tomb. I manually cranked the inner wheel, the rusted gears screaming in protest until the seal broke with a wet pop, revealing the stale, recycled air of the bunker's interior. The smell hit me instantly, not the rot of the cities, but something chemical, sterile, and sharp, like ozone mixed with copper. I clicked my tactical light to high beam, the cone of illumination cutting through the dust motes suspended in the freezing air. This wasn't just a bolt hole. It was a sprawling underground complex, the kind built for the continuity of government. Now nothing more than a concrete coffin. My priority was calories, then warmth, then ammo. In that order. I moved into the intake atrium, sweeping the barrel of my carbine across the shadows. The reception desk was overturned, papers scattered like dry leaves. Behind it lay two bodies in military fatigues. They hadn't turned. They had taken the easy way out, sidearms still clutched in frozen skeletal fingers. I holstered my weapon and approached them, guilt suppressed by necessity. I patted down the first corpse, my gloves stiff with cold. 2 magazines of 5.56 millimeters, a combat knife, and a crushed pack of cigarettes. I took it all. The second soldier had a keycard on a lanyard around his neck, clearance level 4, bio-containment. I slipped it into my pocket. Scavenging the dead was routine now, a grim ritual where I traded their dignity for my survival. Moving past the atrium, the facility descended into the mountain. I followed the signs toward the mess hall, hoping for unlidded pantries. The corridors were lined with pipes that groaned under the thermal stress of the mountain's frost. Level 2 was the living quarters and cafeteria. It was a scene of interrupted chaos. Trays were shattered on the floor, mummified remains of a meal undisturbed for years. I bypassed the main serving area and went straight for the kitchen storage. The lock on the pantry door had been shot out, likely during the initial panic. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare, picked clean by the staff before whatever happened, happened. But they had missed the back corners. I found a crate of freeze-dried peaches and 3 boxes of military-grade MREs hidden behind a stack of empty flour sacks. I tore open a packet of peanut butter, squeezing the paste directly into my mouth. The fat and sugar hit my bloodstream like a drug, sharpening my focus. I stuffed the rest into my rucksack until the zipper strained. With my stomach settled, I turned my attention to the deeper levels. The keycard burned a hole in my pocket. Biocontainment. That was where the answers were, and maybe where the danger lay. I descended the stairwell, the air growing colder with every step, dropping well below freezing. The ambient moisture had crystallized on the walls, turning the concrete into a glittering tunnel of ice. At the bottom, a heavy blast door waited, the card reader flickering with residual backup power. I swiped the card. Green light. The door groaned open, revealing a hallway bathed in ultraviolet sanitation lights. This was the lab. Unlike the upper levels, there were no signs of panic here. It was clinical, orderly. I moved room to room, scavenging high-value medical supplies, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sterile sutures, adrenaline injectors. Gold dust in the wasteland. But it was the central observation deck that stopped me cold. A wall of reinforced glass looked down into a containment pit. Inside were specimens. Not the shamblers I fought in the cities. Those were mindless, rotting sacks of meat. These were different. They were frozen in place, standing upright, their skin translucent and blue-veined, stretched tight over enhanced musculature. I approached a terminal on the desk, praying the drive was still spinning. It woke up with a keystroke. I accessed the logs, scrolling past the administrative debris to the final entries from a Dr. Eris Thorne. *log 442, the pathogen is not merely viral, it is adaptive. Strain Delta has responded to the sub-zero environment of the sector. In standard subjects, the cold slows metabolic function until freezing occurs. Delta subjects, however, have developed a hyperviscous biological antifreeze in their bloodstream. They do not freeze, they enter a suspended cryostate. It preserves the host indefinitely. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked back through the glass. There were a dozen of them down there. Preserved. Waiting. *log 445, we made a mistake. We thought the cold would contain them. It only refined them. The virus has rewired the nervous system to act as a thermal sensor. They are blind deaf, but they can detect a heat signature variance of 0.1 degrees from 100 meters. They don't hunt by sound anymore. They hunt by warmth. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the glass again. Condensation from my breath was fogging the surface. My body heat. I was a beacon in this freezer. Below, in the pit, one of the pale figures twitched. A head snapped up, face featureless except for a mouth filled with serrated, needle-like teeth. It didn't have eyes, just raw, sensitive pits where the orbits used to be. It turned its head slowly, orienting directly toward me, toward the heat radiating from the observation window. I stepped back, extinguishing my light, but it was too late. The creature let out a sound that wasn't a moan. It was a high-pitched chattering, like ice cracking under pressure. The others in the pit began to stir, their limbs jerking as the dormancy cycle broke. They moved with a terrifying, spasmodic speed, devoid of the lethargy of the surface zombies. One of them launched itself at the reinforced glass below me, hitting it with force that shook the floor. The glass held, but spider webs of white fractures bloomed at the impact site. I grabbed the drive from the terminal, ripping it out of the port. I needed to know how to kill them, how to stop this evolution before it migrated down the mountain with the spring thaw. If these things got out, hunters that could track body heat, faster and stronger than the shamblers, humanity was finished. I ran. I sprinted back toward the stairwell, my boots slamming against the linoleum. Behind me, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the lab, followed by the wet slap of bare feet on cold tile. They were out. I didn't look back. I could hear them chattering, a chorus of clicking teeth closing the distance. They didn't breathe heavy, they didn't tire. They just flowed like liquid mercury. I hit the stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning in the frigid air. The heavy steel door at the top of the landing was my only chance. I scrambled through it, spinning the locking wheel just as a heavy body slammed against the other side. The metal buckled slightly, the impact resonating through my arms. I could hear the scratching, the frantic clawing at the steel, and that incessant, hungry chattering. I backed away, weapon raised, shaking uncontrollably. I was safe for the moment, trapped on level 2 with a backpack full of food and a pocket full of nightmares. I looked at the sealed door. The cold wasn't our ally anymore. The world had frozen over, and the monsters had just put on their winter coats. I checked the magazine in my rifle. 28 rounds. I sat against the wall, watching the door handle vibrate, and waited for my body heat to dissipate, praying I could become as cold as the dead before they found a way through. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in weeks. It didn't just shut out the howling wind of the blizzard, it severed the connection to the world that had died outside. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, ringing in my ears like the aftermath of an explosion. I stood in the decontamination airlock, the red emergency lights bathing the steel walls in the color of dried blood. I checked my Geiger counter. The needle trembled but stayed within the green. Whatever killed this place, it wasn't radiation. I stripped off my outer layers, the frozen crust of my parka cracking as I moved. My breath no longer frosted in the air, but the temperature here was still dangerously low. The facility was running on minimal power, likely a geothermal backup deep in the mountain's crust. I gripped my rifle, the polymer stock cold against my cheek, and pushed through the secondary seal into the atrium. It was a cavernous space, a brittlest cathedral of concrete and reinforced glass that overlooked a dark abyss of stairwells and elevator shafts. Dust motes danced in the beams of my tactical light, undisturbed for what looked like years. But it wasn't empty. The reception desk, marked with the emblem of the Department of Defense, was a barricade. Tables had been overturned, servers ripped from the walls, and spent brass casings carpeted the floor like metallic confetti. I moved closer, boots crunching on broken glass. Scavenging was a habit now, a reflex. I checked the bodies slumped behind the desk first. Skeletal remains in rot-resistant tactical gear. No bite marks. They had bullet holes in their skulls. Self-inflicted. The scene told a story of despair, not an overrun. They had sealed the doors and realized they were trapped with something worse than the cold. I raided their vests. 3 magazines of 5.56 millimeters, a combat knife with a serrated spine, and a heavy-duty flashlight. Gold. I found a map of the facility laminated on the wall. Site 14. Cryogenic Virology and Biowarfare Defense. My stomach turned. I hadn't found a sanctuary. I had found the kitchen where they cooked the plague. I descended to sublevel 2, Habitation and Mess. The air here was stale, smelling of ozone and ancient copper. Scavenging the cafeteria was grim work. Trays were still laid out with molded gray sludge that used to be food. I ignored the tables and went for the pantry. The heavy steel door had been welded shut from the outside, but the welds had rusted. A pried bar from my pack and 20 minutes of straining muscles popped it open. Inside was a jackpot that made my hands shake. Crates of MREs, freeze-dried fruit, and gallon jugs of distilled water. I shoveled as much as I could carry into my rucksack, the weight comforting. But amidst the supplies, I found the first anomaly. In the corner of the pantry, huddled behind a stack of flour sacks, was a corpse that didn't look right. It wasn't skeletal. It was mummified, preserved by the dry, cold air, but the skin was wrong. It was translucent, shimmering like beetle chitin. I leaned in closer, shining my light on its face. The jaw had unhinged, splitting down the middle of the chin, and the teeth had been replaced by jagged, needle-like shards of bone. This wasn't the standard Shambler rot. This was evolution. I used the tip of my knife to prod the skin. It was hard, calcified. The infection had adapted to the environment. The virus wasn't just reanimating dead tissue anymore. It was armor-plating it. I left the pantry, the thrill of the food dampened by the dread of the discovery. I needed answers. I needed to know what I was sharing this mountain with. I headed for sublevel 4, Research and Containment. The stairwell was blocked by debris on the 3rd floor, forcing me to pry open elevator doors and rappel down the shaft. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the geothermal heating failing to reach the bowels of the bunker. Level 4 was a slaughterhouse. Unlike the clean suicide of the lobby, this floor had seen a war. The blast doors to the main lab were twisted outward, the metal rent like wet paper. Inside, the lab equipment was smashed. I stepped over a shattered cryotube, the glass crunching loudly. On a central terminal, a single green light blinked. The backup power was keeping the logs alive. I wiped the frost from the screen and accessed the files. The last entry was dated 6 months after the initial outbreak. It was a video log. A woman in a lab coat, her face gaunt, her eyes manic, filled the screen. Dr. Eris Thorne. The beta strain is responding to the temperature drop, she whispered, her voice distorted by static. We thought the cold would slow them down. We were wrong. The virus, it binds to cellular water. It prevents crystallization. It acts as a biological antifreeze. But the energy cost is massive. They don't just eat flesh for sustenance anymore. They hunt for thermal energy. They are heat seekers. And the carapace. God, they are molting. The soft tissue hardens to retain heat. We created super predators. We tried to purge Sector 5, but they coordinated. They're not mindless. The cold made them efficient. The log ended. I stood in the flickering light, the realization washing over me. The zombies outside were slow, freezing solid in the winter. But in here, in the dark and the cold, they had become something else. Something that hunted heat. I instinctively dimmed my flashlight. My body heat, the heat of the generator, the heat of the battery in my pocket, I was a beacon. I looked around the lab with new eyes. The shattered cryotubes weren't broken from the outside. They were hatched. I moved to the back of the lab, toward a secure storage locker marked experimental samples. If I was going to die here, I was going to die with the best gear I could find. I bypassed the electronic lock with a decryption dongle I'd scavenged from a dead IT tech months ago. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung open. Inside, I didn't find a cure, but I found tools. A prototype thermal optic scope, bulky but functional. A suppressed MP7 with armor-piercing rounds. And a suit. A hazmat suit interwoven with thermal masking material, designed to hide the wearer's heat signature from the very things they were studying. I stripped quickly, shivering violently as the freezing air bit my skin, and pulled on the suit. It was tight, rubbery, and smelled of talc, but as I sealed the helmet, the HUD flickered to life. I attached the thermal scope to my rifle and scanned the room. The room that I thought was empty was awash in colors of blue and gray. The walls were -10 degrees. The floor was -12. But in the ventilation shaft above the terminal I had just used, there was a patch of deep, angry red. I froze. The vent grate was screwed shut, but the heat signature behind it was motionless. It was dormant. Hibernating. Waiting for a trigger. My use of the terminal, the sudden spike in electrical activity, must have stirred it. I backed away slowly, my boots silent on the linoleum. I had food. I had weapons. I had intel on the evolution of the plague. Now I just had to get out. But the bunker had a layout that forced me to loop through the containment sector to reach the emergency stairs. I moved into the hallway. The thermal scope revealed the horror of the place. The walls were lined with what looked like organic insulation, a webbing of fungal-like tissue that pulsed with a faint, low-grade heat. The infection was terraforming the bunker. It was turning the concrete into a hive. As I turned the corner toward the exit, I saw them. 3 of them. They weren't shambling. They stood rigid, like statues carved from ice and bone. Their skin was slate gray, faceted like diamonds. They blocked the corridor. I raised the rifle, the thermal scope painting them in cool blues, except for their chests. A burning core of orange heat pulsed in their rib cages. The fusion of virus and host, burning calories at a hyper-accelerated rate to survive the freeze. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The thermal masking suit was my only chance. One of the creatures twitched. Its head snapped toward me, the movement mechanical and instant. It didn't have eyes, just smooth, armored ridges where the sockets should have been. It sniffed the air, slits in its neck flaring. It couldn't see me. It couldn't feel my heat. But it could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. I took a step back. A single spent casing, one I had missed in my initial scan, rolled under my heel. Asterisk click. Asterisk. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the bunker, it was a gunshot. The 3 statues exploded into motion. They didn't moan, they shrieked, a sound like tearing metal. They sprinted on all 4s, claws gouging sparks from the floor, moving faster than any infected I had ever seen. I dropped the stealth approach and squeezed the trigger. The suppressed cough of the MP7 spat armor-piercing rounds down the hall. I aimed for the heat. The first round punched through the glowing orange chest of the lead creature. It didn't fall. It stumbled, fluid spraying, and kept coming. The carapace was bullet-resistant. Headshots don't work if the brain is frozen, I muttered, shifting aim. I targeted the joints. I shattered the knee of the second one, sending it crashing into the wall. The first one was on me. I didn't have time to aim. I jammed the muzzle of the rifle into its open, multi-mandibled mouth and fired on full auto. The back of its head blew out in a spray of black ichor and bone shards. It collapsed, its weight driving me to the ground. The thermal suit screamed a proximity warning. The heat from its core was searing, melting the outer layer of my armor. I kicked the carcass off and scrambled up. The third one was crawling on the ceiling, digging its claws into the ventilation ducts, dropping directly in front of my exit path. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pulled the pin on a flash-bang-eyed scavenge from the lobby and bowled it forward. I closed my eyes and turned away. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The concussive force rattled my teeth. The creature on the floor shrieked in confusion, its sensory organs overwhelmed. I vaulted over its thrashing body, my boots slipping on the slime it secreted. I hit the stairwell door, slamming the panic bar. It held. Locked. Come on! I screamed, slamming it again. The creature behind me was recovering, the clicking of its claws on the tile getting louder. I raised my rifle to the hinges, 3 shots, 3 sparks. I kicked the door. It groaned and gave way. I tumbled into the stairwell and jammed the barrel of my rifle through the handles, barring the door. Seconds later, a heavy impact shook the metal. Then another. They were throwing themselves against it. I didn't wait to see if the rifle would hold. I sprinted up the stairs, 2 at a time, my lungs burning, the weight of the MREs dragging me down. I didn't stop until I hit the surface airlock. I burst out into the snow, the blizzard blinding me, the wind stealing the heat from my body instantly. I collapsed in the drift, gasping, staring back at the massive steel door of the bunker. I had food for months. I had weapons. But I knew the truth now. The cold wasn't our ally. The winter wasn't killing them. It was forging them into something worse. And I had just rung the dinner bell. The hydraulic seal broke with a sound like a tearing scream. The accumulation of rust and ice protesting against the sudden movement of the heavy iron wheel. I threw my weight against it, boots slipping on the frozen concrete of the exterior platform, until the airlock door hissed and swung inward. A gust of stale, pressurized air hit me, smelling of ozone, old copper, and the distinct, cloying scent of recirculated death. I stepped inside, the beam of my tactical light cutting through dust motes that had likely hung suspended in the stillness for years. The blast door clanged shut behind me, sealing out the howling wind of the blizzard, but the silence that replaced it was infinitely heavier. I was in. The layout was standard military sterile, brushed steel walls, color-coded floor stripes, and emergency lighting that flickered with a rhythmic, dying pulse as the backup generators sensed motion. My breath plumed before me. It was colder inside than I had expected, an unnatural chill that seemed to radiate from the very structure of the bunker. My primary objective was sustenance, secondary was defense. I moved past the security checkpoint, stepping over the desiccated corpse of a guard slumped in a chair. His sidearm was gone, but the holster remained. I didn't stop to loot the body. The uniform was shredded, not by teeth, but by something that looked like shrapnel or jagged glass. I followed the yellow stripe on the floor labeled commissary. The corridors were labyrinthine, a maze of forgotten bureaucracy buried under a mile of granite. Every shadow looked like a threat, every dripping pipe sounded like a footstep. When I reached the mess hall, the scene was chaotic. Overturned tables, trays scattered like confetti, and stains that had dried into black abstract art on the linoleum. But the pantry was a goldmine. The heavy locking mechanism had been fused shut, likely by a panicked cook trying to keep the infected out, or the survivors inside. I used the crowbar, sweating despite the cold, the metal screeching in the dark. Inside, shelves floor to ceiling packed with MREs, bulk cans of peaches, freeze-dried stews, and gallons of distilled water. I tore open a pack of beef ravioli, eating it cold, the grease coating my tongue. I filled my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders. This was life. This was another month of survival. But as I scavenged, I noticed the anomalies. The back of the pantry had a ventilation grate that had been ripped open. Not unscrewed, ripped. The steel mesh was curled outward, as if something had pushed its way in from the ducts. And there was a residue on the edges. I touched it with a gloved finger. It wasn't slime or blood. It was crystalline, brittle, crumbling into a fine blue-gray powder. It burned the leather of my glove slightly. I wiped it off on my pants, a cold knot tightening in my gut. This wasn't standard necrosis. The infection out there in the cities turned people into mindless, rotting shamblers. This residue suggested chemistry, biology, change. I pushed deeper, descending to level 3, research and containment. The air grew thinner here, sharper. I needed weapons. The armory was situated next to the labs, a tactical decision that screamed we knew this would go wrong. The door to the armory was open. Bad sign. Inside, the racks were mostly bare, picked clean by the fleeing personnel, but in the back, locked in a heavy cage. I found a silenced 23 Malawin Quachas and a crate of incendiary rounds. I loaded the mags with shaking hands. Why incendiary? Standard rounds put a Z down if you hit the brain. Fire was usually reserved for crowd control, unless the targets had changed. I crossed the hall into the main lab. This is where the story of the bunker unraveled. Rows of glass containment cells lined the walls, most shattered. In the center of the room sat a terminal, its screen glowing with a faint amber light. I tapped the keys, bringing up the last entry logs. The timestamps were from 2 winters ago. The author was a Dr. Eris Thorne. I scanned the text, and the blood drained from my face. Subject 44B exhibits unique adaptation to cryogenic stasis. The pathogen does not go dormant in sub-zero temperatures. It crystallizes. The viral structure forms a lattice network, reinforcing the host's skeletal structure. It's no longer just reanimating dead tissue, it's armoring it. Subjects show hive mind tendencies when in close proximity to ice. We thought the cold would kill them. We were wrong. We just gave them a better environment. I looked up from the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shattered glass of the containment cells wasn't on the floor. It was embedded in the walls opposite the cells. They hadn't been broken from the outside. The subjects had broken out. A noise from the dark corner of the lab froze me. It wasn't a moan. It was a clicking sound, like hail hitting a tin roof. I raised the 23 Malawin Quachas, the flashlight beams sweeping across the overturned centrifuges and broken microscopes. There, clinging to the ceiling pipes, was one of them. It didn't look like the rot bags in the city. Its skin was pale blue, taut against the bone, and covered in patches of jagged, translucent ice crystals that grew out of its flesh like fungal armor. Its eyes were gone, replaced by solid white orbs of frost. It didn't breathe, it just clicked, its jaw vibrating. It dropped. Not a clumsy fall, but a predatory lunge. I fired. The silenced shots puffed into its chest, but the bullets sparked off the icy carapace protecting its torso. It shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and scrambled toward me on all fours, faster than any human should be. I aimed for the head, squeezing the trigger. The round connected, shattering the ice mask covering its face, exposing raw, frozen muscle underneath. It stumbled but didn't stop. It wasn't relying on a functioning brain stem in the traditional sense. The crystalline network Dr. Thorne described was likely conducting motor signals throughout the body. I switched targets, aiming for the joints, knees, elbows, trying to shatter the structure holding it together. I retreated backward, knocking over a tray of scalpels. The thing lunged again, its crystallized claws tearing through my jacket, grazing the Kevlar vest I'd scavenged weeks ago. The cold radiating off it was intense, numbing my skin instantly. I kicked it back, the impact jarring my leg like kicking a concrete pillar. I remembered the incendiary rounds. I fumbled for the spare mag, the creature recovering and coiling for another strike. I slammed the magazine home and racked the slide just as it leapt. I fired 3 rounds point-blank into its chest. The reaction was immediate. The magnesium payload ignited upon impact, burning hot and bright. The creature convulsed, the fire not just burning the flesh but causing the ice armor to undergo rapid thermal shock. The crystals shattered explosively, sending shards of biological shrapnel flying across the room. It flailed, screeching as the fire consumed the viral lattice, turning the terrifying predator into a writhing heap of steam and char. I stood over the smoking remains, chest heaving, the smell of burned ozone and cooking meat filling the small space. I looked at the crystals scattered on the floor. They were melting, turning into a black, viscous sludge that hissed against the tile. The infection had evolved. The mountains weren't a sanctuary. They were a breeding ground for a hunter-killer variant. I grabbed the hard drive from the terminal, ripping it from the casing. I needed to know more. I needed to know if this was isolated to the bunker or if the entire winter wasteland was hiding these things under the snow drifts. As I turned to leave, the amber light of the terminal flickered one last time, displaying a system status map of the facility. The ventilation network. Red warning lights were blinking in every sector. Motion detected. Hundreds of signals. They weren't sleeping anymore. I had rung the dinner bell. I racked the slide of my pistol, checked the seal on my mask, and headed for the darkness of the corridor. The bunker wasn't a shelter. It was a tomb, and I had to dig my way out. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in months. A mechanical sigh that severed the connection to the howling blizzard outside. Then, the silence fell. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library, but the heavy, pressurized silence of a tomb. My breath plumed in the beam of my tactical light, the only source of illumination in the vast, concrete atrium of the bunker. The air tasted of recycled ozone and stale copper, a distinct shift from the crisp, pine-scented frost of the mountain. I wasn't safe yet, I knew that, but I was inside. I swept the beam across the room. The reception desk was a fortress of brushed steel, behind which sat the skeletal remains of the welcome party. They weren't shamblers. They were slumped over, still strapped into their chairs, seemingly dead before they could even rise. I vaulted the desk, boots skidding on the polished linoleum, and checked the first corpse. The skin was desiccated, pulled tight over the bone-like parchment, but it was the color that stopped me. A deep, bruised purple, veined with intricate, raised black lines that looked less like blood vessels and more like frost patterns on a window. This was my first clue that the infection down here hadn't just survived the isolation, it had changed. I focused on the immediate need, scavenging. My pack was light, hauntingly so, containing only a half-empty bottle of frozen water and 3 rounds for my sidearm. I rifled through the pockets of the dead guards. An encoded keycard, a pack of gum that turned to dust when I touched it, and finally, a standard-issue sidearm with a full magazine. I checked the slide. Clean. Well-oiled. I holstered it, the weight on my hip a small comfort against the encroaching dark. Under the desk, I found a stash that made my stomach cramping intensify, a half-eaten, mummified apple and a sealed emergency ration bar. I tore the wrapper with my teeth, the taste of dry oats and synthetic chocolate flooding my mouth. It was the best thing I'd ever eaten. Moving deeper, I bypassed the elevators, death traps and a power outage, and located the stairwell. The heavy fire door groaned in protest, the sound echoing down the shaft like a dinner bell. I froze, weapon raised, listening. Nothing but the settling of tons of concrete and rock. I descended. Level B1, habitation. Level B2, research. I chose B1 first. Survival rules, secure calories, then curiosity. The habitation deck was a ghost town of unmade bunks and personal effects left in mid-use. It looked like an evacuation that never happened. I moved room to room, the beam of my light cutting through the dust motes. In the mess hall, I hit the jackpot. The pantry door had been welded shut, likely to keep the infected out, or the healthy in. I spent 20 minutes sweating in the freezing air, prying the hinges with a crowbar I found in a janitor's closet. When the metal finally shrieked and gave way, I was greeted by shelves of industrial-sized cans. Peaches. Beef stew. Powdered milk. I loaded my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders, the sheer gluttony of the horde making me dizzy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. For the first time in 2 years, I was wealthy. But the unease returned when I moved to the medical bay adjacent to the barracks. Here, the signs of struggle were evident. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and dried blood painted abstract horrors on the floor. I found a clipboard on a nursing station, the pages yellowed. The handwriting was frantic. Subject 88 shows no necrotic decay. Cellular regeneration is accelerating in response to the sub-zero environment. The virus isn't killing them anymore, it's optimizing them. Optimizing. The word hung in my mind cold and clinical. I grabbed a handful of antibiotics and painkillers from the smashed cabinets, stuffing them into my pockets. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A sound from the ventilation duct above me. Not a moan. Not the mindless shuffling of the dead I was used to. It was a clicking sound. Rhythmic. Purposeful. Like nails tapping on sheet metal. I killed my light. Darkness swallowed the room, absolute and suffocating. I crouched behind an overturned gurney, gripping my pistol with white-knuckled intensity. The clicking stopped. Then, a heavy thud as the vent grate 5 meters away hit the floor. Something dropped down. I listened to its breathing. It was rapid, hyperventilating, sounding more like a steam engine than a set of lungs. I risked a flicker of the light, just a second. What I saw seared itself into my retinas. It was humanoid, but elongated. The limbs were stretched, the joints swollen and armored with callus. It wore the shredded remnants of a lab coat. But the face. The jaw had unhinged, splitting down the middle, and the eyes were gone, replaced by patches of that same black. Frost-like sensory tissue I'd seen on the guards. It was blind, but as it turned its head, the black patches pulsed. It could sense heat. It could sense me. I didn't wait. I fired. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The creature didn't stumble. It shrieked, a high-pitched harmonic that vibrated in my teeth, and lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of pale limbs. I threw myself to the side, the gurney clattering as the thing smashed into it, shredding the metal frame with bone spurs protruding from its wrists. This wasn't a rotting corpse. This was a predator. I scrambled back, firing 2 more shots. One went wide, sparking off the wall, but the second took it in the shoulder. Instead of blood, a black, viscous sludge sprayed out, sizzling where it hit the floor. The creature didn't even slow down. It pivoted, tracking my body heat. I realized my mistake. The kinetic energy of the bullets wasn't enough. I needed to disrupt its structure. I saw a fire extinguisher mounted on the far wall. I holstered the pistol and sprinted. The creature was on me instantly, its claws raking across my backpack, tearing through the canvas and sending cans of peaches rolling across the floor. The weight shift threw me off balance, and I slammed into the wall. I grabbed the extinguisher, ripped the pin, and didn't aim for the creature. I swung the heavy canister like a club. The impact connected with its skull with a sickening crunch. The creature reeled back, stunned. I didn't hesitate. I jammed the nozzle into its open, split jaw and squeezed the trigger. A cloud of freezing CO2 blasted directly into its internal organs. The creature convulsed, the thermal shock seemingly overloading its adapted biology. It thrashed, knocking me backward, and then fell silent, its movement ceasing as the black sludge in its veins froze solid. I lay there on the cold tile, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I shone the light on the carcass. The black veins had turned white. The optimization the logs spoke of had made them faster and stronger, but also brittle to extreme temperature shifts. They were built for the cold, but sudden, intense freezing shattered their equilibrium. I gathered my spilled supplies with shaking hands. The can of peaches was dented, leaking syrup onto the floor. I licked it off my finger. Sugar, energy, life. I couldn't stay here. The shriek would have attracted others. I moved to the heavy security door at the end of the medical wing, swipe hacking the panel with the dead guard's keycard. The lock disengaged with a clank. Inside was an armory. Racks of assault rifles, shelves of ammunition, tactical vests. But what caught my eye wasn't the weaponry. It was the map on the back wall. It showed the bunker complex. I was in Sector 1. There were 12 sectors. And right in the center, circled in red marker, was a room labeled cryostasis/viral origin. I grabbed a rifle, checking the action. The weight of the weapon felt different now. Before, I was fighting to survive the day. Now, looking at that map, seeing the horrifying evolution of the enemy that awaited me in the dark, I realized I was fighting a war I hadn't known existed. I barricaded the door, listening to the clicking starting up again in the vents outside. Let them come. I had ammo, I had food, and I knew their weakness. The bunker wasn't just a shelter, it was a dungeon, and I was going to kill the dragon at the bottom of it. The hydraulics hiss with a sound like a dying lung, echoing through the cavernous entry hall of the facility. As the blast door grinds shut behind me, sealing out the blinding white of the mountain blizzard, the absolute silence of the bunker presses in. It isn't the quiet of an empty room, it is the suffocating stillness of a tomb that hasn't been disturbed in a decade. My breath plumes in the beam of my tactical light, the only source of warmth in a concrete throat that plunges deep into the earth. The air scrubbers are dead, leaving the atmosphere stale, tasting faintly of ozone and old rubber. I checked the seal on my respirator. Down here, infection vectors could be airborne, preserved in the subterranean chill just waiting for a host to thaw them out. I sweep the flashlight across the reception checkpoint. It's a slaughterhouse frozen in time. Several bodies in military fatigues lie sprawled behind the reinforced glass of the security booth, their weapons still gripped in desiccated hands. They didn't turn. They were executed. Bullet holes riddle the glass, shattering the chaotic reflection of my own scavenge hazmat gear. I vault the turnstile, boots crunching on spent brass casings, and begin the first pass of scavenging. Priority 1 is power. Priority 2 is perimeter security. The hunger gnawing at my stomach is a distant third. I pry open a locker marked Site Security. Jackpot. A P-90 submachine gun with 3 magazines, a box of 5. 7mm ammunition, and a high-yield flare gun. The weapons are cold enough to burn my gloved skin, coated in a thin layer of frost. I swap my makeshift pry bar for the firearm, the weight of it offering a false sense of security. Pushing deeper, I bypass the elevators, death traps and a power outage, and take the emergency stairwell. The descent is endless, the concrete walls painted with frantic scratches and smear marks that look like dry tar. On level B3, the air temperature drops significantly. This sector is labeled cryogenic research and viral containment. My Geiger counter clicks once, then falls silent. It's not radiation I need to worry about. I force a jam nut into the door mechanism of a lab labeled subject observation. Inside, the scene shifts from military tragedy to scientific nightmare. The room is lined with shattered observation tanks. The floor is slick with a frozen, amber substance that looks like resin. I step carefully, avoiding the glass. On a center console, a terminal blinks with a low battery warning, running off a localized backup. I tap the keyboard, and the screen flickers to life, displaying the last entry log, Project Winter Solstice. Day 402. I read the logs, and the blood drains from my face. The government didn't come here to hide from the infection, they came here to weaponize it. The log details an evolution of the pathogen I haven't seen on the surface. They called it strain 0K. The standard shamblers, the ones rotting in the cities, were just the incubators. This strain was engineered to survive extreme cold by producing a natural antifreeze in the host's blood. A hyperglucose compound that prevents crystallization of the cells. But the side effect wasn't preservation, it was acceleration. The virus didn't just reanimate the brain stem, it rewired the nervous system for efficiency. It stripped away pain receptors and muscle inhibitors. I stop reading. A sound drifts from the darkness of the adjacent containment wing. It's not a moan. It's a clicking sound. Like teeth snapping together in a rhythmic code. I raise the P-90, clicking the safety off. The beam of my light cuts through the gloom, revealing rows of metal gurneys. Most are empty. One is not. A figure stands near the far wall, facing away from me. It's naked, its skin a translucent, alabaster white, stripped of all pigment. The spine protrudes sharply, the vertebrae enlarged and jagged, piercing through the skin like a dorsal ridge of bone. This is the evolution. The cold didn't kill it, it refined it. The creature twitches, its head snapping back with impossible speed. It doesn't turn around. Its neck rotates a full 180 degrees, the cracking of cartilage echoing like a gunshot. There are no eyes, just smooth, white skin where the sockets should be, and a mouth that unhinges to reveal rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth. It senses heat. It senses me. The creature shrieks, a high-pitched, oscillating frequency that vibrates in my teeth, and launches itself off the wall. It moves unlike any zombie I've fought. It doesn't shamble. It skitters on all fours, clinging to the ceiling pipes like a spider. I fire. The P-90 roars in the confined space, the muzzle flash illuminating the horror and strobe light fragments. Bullets tear into its shoulder, but there's no blood, only a spray of clear, viscous fluid. It doesn't slow down. It drops from the ceiling, landing feet from me, its claws, elongated finger bones sharpened to points, slashing at my chest. The Kevlar of my vest holds, but the force throws me backward into a steel prep table. I kick out, catching it in the midsection, and scramble back. It hisses, the sound wet and gurgling, and prepares to lunge again. I fumble for the flare gun on my belt. These things are adapted to the cold. They thrive in the dark. Heat is their enemy. I fire the flare point blank into its chest. The magnesium ignites with a blinding white intensity. The creature screams, a sound so human it freezes my blood, as the heat sears its hypersensitive flesh. It thrashes wildly, crashing into the shelves, setting fire to the old paperwork. I don't wait to watch it burn. I sprint for the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I slam the stairwell door and jam the handle with the pry bar, I hear them. Not just one. Dozens. The shrieks echo from the ventilation shafts, from the elevator shaft, from the darkness below. The flare didn't just kill the scout, it signaled the hive. The heat woke them up. I stand in the stairwell, chest heaving, listening to the scuttling of claws on metal getting louder, climbing up toward me. I found the bunker, I found the supplies, and I found the truth. But now, trapped under a mountain of ice with a legion of cold-adapted hunters waking from their slumber, I realize the bunker isn't a fortress. It's a larder, and I just rang the dinner bell. The hydraulic wheel groaned, a sound of dying metal echoing against the valley walls like a gunshot, before the seal finally broke. A hiss of pressurized air escaped, smelling of stale ozone and ancient, settled dust, contrasting sharply with the biting, pine-scented purity of the mountain gale behind me. I pushed the heavy blast door inward. It fought me, rusted tracks screaming in protest, until a gap wide enough for my shoulder appeared. I slipped through, leaving the blinding white of the snowstorm for the suffocating, absolute darkness of the intake chamber. My tactical light cut a cone through the gloom, illuminating concrete walls that seemed to sweat condensation. The temperature inside wasn't much better than the outside. The bunker was dead, its reactor likely cold for a decade. I swept the beam across the floor. No bodies. No blood. Just discarded hazmat suits piled in the corner like shed skins. This was a bad sign. Usually, bodies meant a fight, a chaotic end. Empty suits meant an organized retreat, or a purge. I checked my Geiger counter. The needle barely twitched. Radiation wasn't the killer here. I moved to the decontamination showers, the nozzles dry and crusted with white mineral deposits. My boots crunched on glass, a smashed vial, the label too faded to read. I wasn't here for history, though. I was here for calories and caliber. Past the airlock, the facility opened into a central atrium. It was structured like a panopticon, with a central security hub overlooking 3 descending rings of catwalks. I headed for the security hub first, hoping for a map or an armory key. The glass of the booth was bulletproof but spiderwebbed with impact fractures. Someone had tried desperately to get in. Or out. Inside, the skeletal remains of a guard sat slumped over a console, a service pistol rusted to his hand. I pried it loose, checking the magazine. The rounds were corroded, useless. But his belt had a master keycard attached to a retractable lanyard. I took it, along with a half-empty canteen that smelled of rot. My primary target was the mess hall or storage on level 2. I descended the metal stairs, the grating ringing out with every step, announcing my presence to the dark. The silence was heavy, pressurized. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the quiet of a held breath. On level 2, I found the supply cache. The heavy steel door had been welded shut from the outside. Whoever sealed this room didn't want anyone getting to the food, or didn't want what was inside getting out. I didn't have a torch to cut it, so I moved to the ventilation grate near the floor. Unscrewing the bolts took 10 minutes of shivering, knuckle-busting work. I shimmied into the duct, the claustrophobia gripping my chest like a vice. The air here tasted metallic, copper on the tongue. I dropped into the storeroom. It was a jackpot. Rows of metal shelving lined with vacuum-sealed MRE crates, medical supplies, and water filtration tablets. I tore into a crate labeled rations, long-term. Peanut butter, crackers, freeze-dried beef stroganoff. I ripped a packet open and ate the dry powder, not waiting to hydrate it. The burst of salt and preservatives was the best thing I'd tasted in months. I began filling my pack, prioritizing caloric density, while stuffing boxes of 5.56mm ammo into my side pouches. Jackpot number 2. I noticed something on the far wall. A containment unit. Not for food. It was a glass cylinder, shattered. The floor around it was scorched. I stepped closer, shining my light on a clipboard hanging precariously from a hook. The log was dated 3 years after the initial outbreak. Subject 44. Cryostasis failure. I flipped the page. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. The cold doesn't kill it. It slows the necrosis, but the pathogen adapts. It crystallizes the blood. They don't freeze solid. They enter a hypermetabolic hibernation. Heat triggers the wake cycle. Do not engage with thermal optics. Do not use incendiaries. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature rattled my spine. I looked at the scorched floor again. It wasn't burn marks from a fire. It was chemical burns. I turned back to the vent, intending to leave, but a sound stopped me. A wet, rhythmic slapping against the concrete floor. It was coming from the mess hall adjacent to the storage room. I clicked the safety off my rifle, the movement stiff with cold. I peered through the porthole of the swinging kitchen doors. The room was filled with tables, and seated at them were dozens of figures. They were motionless, coated in a layer of frost so thick they looked like statues carved from ice. But they weren't dead. The slapping sound was a drip from a burst pipe hitting the shoulder of a creature in a lab coat. Every time the water hit, the creature twitched. Not a shivering twitch, but a violent, galvanic spasm. The virus had evolved. Outside, the walkers were slow, rotting bags of meat that fell apart in the winter. Here, preserved by the sub-zero temperatures of the unpowered bunker, they had changed. Their skin was a translucent blue-black, pulled tight over bone. They had no lips, just exposed, gumless teeth that looked like serrated obsidian. The terrifying part was the heat signature. I could feel the warmth radiating from my own body, trapped in my winter gear. In this meat locker, I was a walking flare. I backed away slowly, but my boots snagged on a loose strap of my backpack. I stumbled, my rifle barrel clanking against the metal shelf. The sound was deafening in the stillness. In the mess hall, 50 heads snapped toward the noise in perfect unison. There was no groaning, no shuffling. The creature in the lab coat stood up. It didn't wobble. It rose with a mechanical, hydraulic smoothness. The frost on its shoulders cracked and fell like dust. It opened its mouth and inhaled, a sound like a vacuum seal breaking. I scrambled back into the vent, shoving my pack ahead of me. Behind me, the double doors of the mess hall exploded outward. They didn't shamble, they sprinted. The first one hit the storage room wall with the force of a car crash, clawing at the shelves. I kicked myself backward through the duct, hearing the metal screech as they tore at the ventilation opening. These things were stronger, their muscle fibers hardened by the cold rather than atrophied. I tumbled out into the hallway on level 2 and didn't wait to regain my balance. I ran for the stairs. Below me, the grating shook. They were climbing the outside of the stairwell, scaling the metal mesh like spiders. I aimed my light down and saw a face looking up, eyes entirely white, cataract blind but sensing the heat of the beam. It shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that made my teeth ache. I fired. The bullet struck its forehead. Instead of a spray of red mist, black sludge erupted, thick as tar. The impact knocked it back, but it didn't stop. The round hadn't penetrated the skull, it had ricocheted off the frozen bone. They were armored. Headshots don't work, I whispered, panic rising in my throat. I switched to semi-auto and aimed for the joints. I blew the kneecap off the lead climber. It fell, taking 2 others with it into the darkness of the lower levels. I reached the atrium, my lungs burning. I needed to seal the blast door. If these things got out into the valley, they wouldn't freeze, they would hunt. The heat of the sun, the warmth of a survivor's campfire, it would draw them for miles. I sprinted for the control booth, sliding over the desk to the emergency override. The system was dead. Manual crank only. I could hear them swarming the catwalks, the sound of hundreds of naked feet slapping on metal. I threw myself at the manual wheel of the main blast door. It turned agonizingly slow. The gap was still a yard wide. I cranked, my muscles screaming, adrenaline barely overcoming the fatigue. The door groaned, inching shut. A hand shot through the gap. Pale, frozen, fingers tipped with jagged black nails. It clawed at the air inches from my face. I let go of the wheel with one hand, drew my combat knife, and drove it through the hand, pinning it to the frame. The creature didn't scream. It just pulled, tearing its own palm apart to get free. I put both hands back on the wheel and heaved. With a final, bone-jarring clang, the door sealed. I spun the locking mechanism, engaging the deadbolts. Thuds echoed from the other side, heavy, rhythmic impacts. They were throwing themselves against the steel. I collapsed against the cold metal, sliding down to the floor. I was safe from them, for now. But I was still inside the airlock. The outer door was sealed to the storm. The inner door was holding back a legion of evolved, frost-hardened killers. I looked at my pack. Enough food for a month. Enough ammo for a skirmish. But I was trapped in the entryway of a tomb, and I could hear the scratching starting on the other side of the steel. They knew I was here. They could smell the heat. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 years. It wasn't just a mechanical noise. It was the finality of being buried alive. A severance from the howling blizzard outside that had been clawing at my thermal layers for days. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. I stood in the airlock of Outpost Sierra 9, the red emergency lighting bathing the steel walls in the color of dried blood. My breath hung in the air, not as thick clouds anymore, but as thin, terrified wisps. The air scrubbers were humming, a low-frequency vibration I felt in my teeth rather than heard. I checked the Geiger counter strapped to my wrist. Green. Safe. Or as safe as a tomb could be. I raised my rifle, a battered AR-15 that had seen more mud than oil, and clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that had been suspended in stasis since the world ended. The floor was polished concrete, scuffed by the panicked boots of whoever had been here last. I moved forward, the magnetic locks on the inner door disengaging with a clunk that echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a sprawling subterranean city. The signs on the wall were military-grade stencils: logistics, barracks, containment. I chose logistics first. Survival is a hierarchy of needs, and right now, my calorie deficit was making my hands shake. The hallway was littered with debris, overturned gurneys, scattered papers, a shoe missing its foot. But no bodies. That was the first red flag. Usually, these places are mass graves. The absence of corpses implied they had either evacuated, or they had been moved. I pushed into the supply depot, using a crowbar to pry open the cage. The beam of my light swept over rows of metal shelving, and my heart hammered against my ribs. It was a jackpot. A literal gold mine of the old world. Crates of MREs stamped with expiration dates that wouldn't arrive for another decade. Cases of purified water. Filters for gas masks. I tore open a crate, the wax seal cracking, and pulled out a freeze-dried beef stroganoff packet. I didn't bother heating it. I shoveled the dry, crunchy powder into my mouth, the savory chemicals hitting my tongue like a drug. I packed my rucksack until the seams strained, prioritizing the high-calorie density packs and medical supplies. I found a box of epinephrine injectors and a pristine trauma kit. It felt like looting a pharaoh's tomb, stealing from the ghosts of the government. But the scavenging high didn't last. As I moved deeper into the complex, towards the laboratory sector, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, sharper. Frost began to creep up the walls, intricate fractal patterns that looked too organized to be natural. The temperature dropped rapidly, breath misting heavily again. I pulled my scarf tighter. The blast doors to the lab were forced open, the thick steel bent outward as if something had smashed through from the inside. I stepped over the threshold and the smell hit me. Not the sickly sweet scent of rot I was used to in the cities. This smelled like ozone and copper. Like a thunderstorm trapped in a freezer. The lab was a wreck of shattered glass and overturned centrifuges. In the center of the room sat a terminal, its screen flickering with a faint amber glow, powered by the dying embers of the backup reactor. I approached it, wiping the frost from the keyboard. The logs were open. Subject: strain evolution. Entry 442. Dr. Eris Thorne. I tapped the key to read. The text scrolled, jittery and fragmented. The cold is not a deterrent. We were wrong. The cryogenic suspension didn't halt the viral replication, it catalyzed it. The pathogen is adapting to the sub-zero environment of the mountain. It's no longer relying on biological decay to spread. It's crystallizing. I frowned, scrolling down. Entry 450. The subjects are metabolizing the liquid nitrogen coolant. Their blood is turning into a lattice structure, something akin to natural antifreeze but harder, like ablative armor. They don't freeze to death, they enter a hyperdormant state. They are batteries, storing potential energy. When they wake, the discharge is explosive. My blood ran cold, matching the room. I looked up from the screen. Along the back wall were cylindrical tanks. Most were shattered, glass crunching under my boots as I backed away. But one was intact. Inside, floating in a suspension of pale blue fluid, was a man. Or what used to be a man. His skin was translucent, blue-veined, and beneath the dermis, I could see jagged, white protrusions. Not bone. Crystals. They pierced through his shoulders and knuckles, forming natural spikes. His eyes were open, irisless, just milky white orbs staring into the void. I heard a sound. A sharp cracking noise, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. It came from the dark corner of the lab, behind a row of overturned server racks. I killed the flashlight immediately, plunging the room into the dim amber glow of the terminal. I held my breath, the silence rushing back in, deafening. Asterisk crunch. Crunch. Asterisk. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven. The sound of glass being ground into dust under significant weight. I raised the rifle, pressing the stock into my shoulder. The silhouette that emerged from the shadows was massive. It wore the tattered remnants of a hazmat suit, but the suit had been shredded from the inside out. Shards of ice, no biological crystal, jutted from its back and forearms. It didn't shamble like the rotters in the city. It moved with a twitchy, predatory precision. It stopped. It turned its head, the neck cracking audibly. It couldn't see me in the dark, but I realized with horror that it could sense me. The heat. It was hunting thermal signatures. I was a burning flare in a room of absolute zero. It lunged. The speed was impossible for something dead. I squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk the 5.56 rounds sparked off the creature's chest. They didn't penetrate. They shattered against the crystalline plating covering its torso. It roared, a sound that wasn't a moan but a high-pitched shriek of grinding tectonic plates. I dove to the right as it smashed the terminal where I had been standing, metal shearing like paper. I scrambled over the debris, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I needed high caliber. The AR was useless against this armor. I remembered the armory manifest I'd seen in logistics. A shotgun. Slugs. I fired blindly behind me to suppress it, the bullets ricocheting wildly. The creature didn't slow down. It barreled through a lab table, tossing it aside with one arm. I sprinted for the door, my lungs burning with the intake of freezing air. I made it into the corridor, hitting the manual release for the bulkhead. The heavy door began to slide shut, agonizingly slow. The creature slammed into the gap, its crystalline arm jamming the door open. It snarled, its face inches from mine through the opening. Up close, I saw the evolution. The virus had consumed the soft tissue and replaced it with this diamond-hard structure. It was beautiful in a grotesque, terrifying way. It swiped at me, the jagged spikes on its hand tearing through my jacket and slicing my forearm. I screamed, falling back, kicking at the manual override lever with my boot. With a hydraulic groan, the door crushed the creature's arm. It shrieked, the limb snapping off with the sound of a gunshot. The door slammed shut, sealing the monstrosity inside. I lay on the floor, gasping, clutching my bleeding arm. I looked at the severed limb on the floor. It wasn't bleeding. The wound was capped with jagged blue ice. The fingers were still twitching, scratching at the concrete. I scrambled up, backing away, realization dawning on me. The government hadn't abandoned this bunker because they ran out of food. They sealed it because they had created something worse than the infection. They had weaponized it, accidentally or not. And now, I was locked in with them. I checked my arm again. The cut was deep, stinging with a cold fire. I fumbled for the medical kit I had scavenged, pouring alcohol over the wound. Then I saw it. The blood wasn't clotting red. Around the edges of the cut, a faint, fractal pattern of frost was beginning to form on my skin, despite the warmth of the hallway. I grabbed the heavy bandage and wrapped it tight, tighter than necessary, trying to cut off the circulation, trying to deny what I was seeing. I needed to get to the armory. I needed a shotgun, and I needed fire. Lots of fire. The scavenger hunt was over. The war had just begun. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 6 months. It cut through the howling wind of the blizzard outside, a mechanical scream of rusted gears grinding against a decade of ice. As the massive steel slab inched open, revealing the abyss of the bunker's atrium, the air pressure equalized with a pop that made my ears ring. I didn't step in immediately. I waited, M4 raised, breath pluming in the frantic white clouds before me, listening for the groans, the shuffles, the guttural wet noises of the dead. But there was only the hum of the auxiliary power, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth more than I heard. The air that rolled out wasn't just stale. It was chemical, tasting of ozone and industrial disinfectant, underscored by the copper tang of old, frozen blood. I stepped across the threshold, the beam of my tactical light cutting a cone through the suspended dust motes. The atrium was a mausoleum of bureaucracy. Overturned desks formed a jagged barricade near the security checkpoint. Papers frozen to the floor in sheets of ice that had formed from a burst pipe long ago. I swept the light left then right. Clear. My boots crunched on the frost-covered linoleum, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. I approached the security desk, vaulting over the plexiglass partition. This was the first scavenging priority, access and mapping. The terminal was dead, but the skeletal remains of a guard sat slumped in the chair, a pristine Glock 17 frozen into his grip. I pried it loose, the polymer cold enough to burn my skin through my gloves, and checked the mag full. One in the chamber. He hadn't fired a shot. Why? I stripped his tactical vest, finding a keycard on a retractable lanyard labeled Sector 4 Research. This was a gold mine. Moving past the checkpoint, the facility descended into the mountain. The deeper I went, the colder it got, which defied the logic of geothermal insulation. The walls here were lined with heavy piping, frosted white. I found the first signs of the struggle in the mess hall on level 2. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Trays were scattered, food petrified into gray lumps. But it was the bodies that made me pause. They weren't decomposed. The sub-zero temperatures inside the mountain had mummified them, turning skin to taut, blue leather. I moved among them, scavenging with the detached efficiency of a grave robber. I found 3 sealed MREs, menu 4, pork sausage with gravy. A luxury in the apocalypse, and a heavy woolen blanket stamped with the U.S. government insignia. I stuffed them into my rucksack. It was near the back of the kitchen, by the walk-in freezers, that I noticed the first anomaly. A corpse, wearing the white fatigues of the kitchen staff, was pinned to the wall by a rebar spear. But the wound wasn't right. There was no blood splatter. The entry point was surrounded by a crystalline growth, like red quartz. I leaned in closer, my light dancing over the strange formation. It looked like the blood had erupted and frozen instantly, But the structure was too organized, too geometric to be just ice. I pushed deeper, descending to level 4. The research sector. This was where the money was. I needed antibiotics, adrenaline, anything to keep the inevitable infection at bay if I slipped up. The hallways here were wider, the doors reinforced. I swiped the dead guard's keycard at the first lab door. The reader flashed red, then green, and the maglock disengaged with a heavy thud. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Glass beakers shattered, centrifuges toppled. But the computer terminals, one was flickering. Standby mode. I rushed to it, wiping the frost from the screen. I accessed the logs, skipping the bureaucratic preamble and jumping to the final entries. Entry 449 Dr. Eris Thorne. Subject 12 is displaying unexpected thermal adaptation. The necroa strain usually causes necrotic decay, but in the sub-zero environment of the containment breach, the virus has shifted. It's no longer just reanimating the host, it's preserving it. The cellular structure is hardening. The blood acts as a natural antifreeze, hyperviscous and crystalline. They aren't rotting. They are evolving into something efficient. Something cold. I scrolled down, my heart hammering against my ribs. Entry 452. They respond to heat signatures. The virus has repurposed the host's sensory organs to detect thermal gradients. We turned off the heating to slow them down, but it only made them dormant. They are waiting. If you are reading this, do not restore power to the HVAC systems. Do not raise your body temperature. They are the ice now. I froze. The hum of the auxiliary power I heard earlier, it wasn't HVAC. It was just the lights. But I was here. I was a 98.6-degree beacon in a world of absolute zero. A sound came from the vent above me. Not a groan. A chittering sound, like ice cracking in a thawing river. I slowly raised my weapon, the beam of light shaking. The vent grate exploded outward. The thing that dropped to the floor wasn't a zombie, not the shambling rot bags I was used to. It was pale, blue-skinned, and naked, its body hairless and sleek. Its limbs were elongated, the joints swollen with that red crystalline structure I had seen earlier. It didn't stumble. It crouched on all fours, its head twitching, milky white eyes blind but searching. It sniffed the air, and then it turned directly toward me. It shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that shattered a beaker on the counter, and launched itself. I fired. The 5.56 round hit its center mass, but instead of the wet thud of tearing flesh, there was a crack, like striking a rock. The creature stumbled back, black ichor oozing sluggishly from the wound, but it didn't fall. The cold had hardened its skin into a natural armor. It lunged again, faster this time. I sidestepped, swinging the stock of my rifle into its temple. It felt like hitting a concrete wall. The impact jarred my arms, but it sent the creature skidding across the frosted floor. I didn't wait to see it rise. I turned and sprinted. The corridor was a gauntlet of shadows. I could hear them now, waking up. The sound of lockers rattling, of glass breaking, of vents popping open. They were everywhere, dormant in the walls, waiting for a heat source. Waiting for me. I needed to get to the armory, or a secure room. Level 4 was a death trap. I saw a heavy blast door ahead labeled decontamination. I slammed my shoulder into it, swiping the card with trembling fingers. Access denied? Behind me, the chittering grew into a roar. I looked back. 3 of them were sprinting on the ceiling, their claws digging into the frosted pipes, moving with the jerky, unnatural speed of insects. I aimed for the lead creature, exhaling a cloud of steam. I needed a headshot. I squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash illuminating the hallway in a strobe of terror. The round caught the first one in the eye socket. The kinetic energy finally overcame the hardness of the skull, and its head snapped back, the creature dropping to the floor, twitching. "Come on, you ugly bastards," I hissed, backing up, swiping the card again. "Access granted?" The door hissed open. I threw myself inside and slammed the manual override button. The heavy steel door sealed shut just as a heavy body impacted against it, denting the metal. I was safe, for the moment. I fell back against the wall, sliding down to the floor, chest heaving. I checked the room. It was a decontamination shower, small, tiled, and freezing. But there were lockers here too. I scrambled to them, ripping the doors open. Hazmat suits. Military grade. I pulled one out. It was heavy, lined with thermal insulation. If the logs were right, if they hunted by heat. This suit could mask my signature. It was my only way out. I began to strip off my gear, my hands numb, listening to the creatures scratching at the steel door inches away. They knew I was here. They were testing the metal, their claws scraping like knives on a chalkboard. I found a weapon in the bottom of the locker, a flare gun. A useless toy against the dead, usually. But against things that thrived in the cold? Things that had ice for blood? I loaded a flare, the orange shell bright against the gloom. Heat. They wanted heat. I'd give them heat. I zipped up the hazmat suit, the rubber seal tightening around my neck. The silence inside the suit was suffocating, my own breathing loud in my ears. I checked the seals. Thermal masking active. I was invisible, theoretically. I gripped the door handle. I had to go back out there. I had to get to the lower levels, to the generator. If I could overload the system, maybe I could cook this entire facility, and everything in it. Or maybe I'd just die warm. I unlocked the door. The scratching stopped. They were waiting. I kicked the door open and raised the flare gun. The corridor was filled with them, a dozen pale, blue nightmares clinging to the walls and ceiling. They paused, heads cocking, confused by the sudden disappearance of my heat signature. I aimed the flare gun down the hallway, past the horde, toward the fire suppression system's thermal sensor on the ceiling. "Burn," I whispered. I pulled the trigger.